Fusion 1, the first revision of my Ncase M1 Mini RTX PC. The current demands for the system are gaming at 1080p at max settings above 100 FPS, video and photo editing, 3D modeling, animation work, and plenty of rendering. If you haven't already, you can check out the full build video by clicking the card in the top right hand corner. There was a lot of research and planning that went into this build, and all of the components were chosen around the Ncase M1 Mini RTX chassis. The Ncase M1 is an incredibly optimized Mini RTX case with very little compromise. I modded the case with a tempered glass side panel, which attaches via 3D printed mounts. This way, I can see all of the components inside the case and show off the cable management and lighting. Another mod I did for the case was a new feet design. I didn't really like how the original feet looked, as they just didn't suit the sharp angles of the case, so I modeled it and 3D printed these as well. Now, let's talk about the components. The motherboard of choice is the EVGA Z170 Stinger, which is an ITX motherboard for Intel's Skylake and Kaby Lake CPUs. The design is overall very stealthy and neutral, and this is one of the main reasons I chose this motherboard over other Z170 motherboards. And yes, for those wondering, you will need to update the motherboard BIOS for it to work with Intel's 7th generation Kaby Lake CPUs. EVGA were kind enough to send out an updated BIOS chip for free, and installing it was quite easy. The CPU inside the build is Intel's i7-7700K, which is their top tier 7th generation chip. I decided on the 7700K as I wanted absolutely no CPU bottlenecking when it came to high refresh rate gaming, and wanted the peace of mind that my GPU was operating at 100% the entire time as it should be. The hyper-threading support on the i7 also allows me to juggle multiple tasks at the same time with absolutely no hiccup. I also delidded the 7700K, and doing so I managed to achieve a cooler and quieter system, with drops as far as 15 degrees. This particular chip has reached a stable 5.1 GHz at 1.35 volts, however I keep it clocked at 4.9 GHz, which I'm able to do at stock voltage of 1.2 volts. This gives me a good balance between CPU speed, temperatures, and also noise. Now, the Ncase M1 is a Mini RTX case, so it rules out any of the large tower style coolers such as the Noctua DH15 and CryoRig H7. You can squeeze a liquid AIO in there such as the Corsair H100i, but things start to get quite cramped and I really wanted to be able to see the entire system on display. So I went with CryoRig's M9i, which is a cheap but overall effective CPU cooler. For around $15 or $20 US, this keeps the i7 relatively cool and quiet. For RAM, I went with 16 gigs of Corsair's Dominator Platinum DDR4 memory, which is clocked at 2666 MHz. This is definitely sufficient for the entire demands of the system, even when multitasking a few editing programs. Powering the system is Corsair's SF450, which is a gold-rated modular SFX power supply. A lot of people have expressed their concerns for only running a 450 watt power supply in such a powerful system, but there's been absolutely no problem at all in terms of total system power draw, even when the CPU and GPU are at their max overclock and full load. The TDP of the entire system is 320 watts, which is a good chunk below the gold-rated 450 watts. There's definitely some misconceptions out there on how big you really need to go for your power supply on your PC. Some quick advice: if you're running a single GPU setup with an i5 or i7, then you don't need 600 watts or more of power. You could pick up a more efficient power supply with around 500 watts, which would power your system no problem at all, and that saved money could go towards a bigger SSD or slightly better components. I do see where some of you are coming from though, and Fusion 2, the next iteration of this build, will feature a 600 watt power supply to keep up with a more powerful GPU. Speaking of which, I went with the GTX 1070 Founders Edition card, which I managed to pick up on sale on Boxing Day for 529 Australian dollars, which equates to about 390 US. I was originally planning for a GTX 1060 or RX 480, but the price I got this 1070 for was just too good to pass up. The Founders Edition card does run a little bit noisy, but it's not really a problem if you have headphones on. Below the GPU are two of Corsair's quiet, static pressure 120mm fans, the SP120s. It can be argued whether these do much at all when it comes to cooling the case or GPU, and I plan to test this in the future. At the very least, they are filling the void that would otherwise be left underneath the GPU, and are pulling some fresh air into the case. I decided to stick to SSDs when it came to storage, and this definitely helped save some space inside the M1. I've got a 240GB SanDisk SSD in the back, and a 525GB Crucial MX300 SSD in the front, so almost a total of 800GB of SSD storage all up. Lastly, the custom sleeved cables. The paracord sleeving was provided by nsource.net, and I did all of the measuring, planning, and sleeving myself. I didn't want the sleeving to distract from the overall build and components, so I went with a fairly neutral color scheme of black and white. I also made the cable length as short as possible, and I could probably bet this is the shortest 24-pin motherboard cable you've ever seen. Now, before we get into benchmarks, let's take a look at how far I could overclock the system, and what the temperatures and noise were like in such a tiny case with no exhaust fans. If you've seen my previous videos, then you'd already know I was able to reach a stable 5.1 GHz on the 7700K at 1.35 volts. However, temperatures were a little too toasty for my likings and the CPU fan was spinning fast enough to double as a hairdryer. So I dropped the clock speed down to 4.9 GHz at stock voltage, and I found that this was the sweet spot for the system. The GPU on the other hand didn't have much room to move, as the single 8-pin power connector really prevents any serious overclocking as the power limit becomes a bottleneck. I did however manage a 100 MHz overclock on the core and 300 MHz on the memory. CPU temperatures idle around 35 to 40 degrees Celsius depending on the day, and at full load the furthest I was able to push the i7 was 81 degrees, while it rendered out a 4K scene in Blender. In gaming however, the i7 usually sits around 55 degrees, and the CryRig M9 is pretty quiet around these temperatures. The GPU on the other hand is pretty noisy around full load, but to be quite fair, it is overclocked and I have implemented a custom fan profile to keep the GPU under 75 degrees at full load. I'd personally prefer the GPU to be running at 75 degrees as opposed to 85 at the cost of a slightly louder system. To get an idea of what I mean, here's what the entire system sounds like while gaming, both with the custom fan profile and with the stock fan profile. So let's take a look at how the system performs. 3DMark Time Spy combines both CPU and GPU stress testing, and the system scored 6086, which puts it just under their 4K gaming rig score. 3DMark Firestrike also combines both discrete physics and GPU rendering, and here the system scored 15,522. In Cinebench R15, the overclocked i7 scored 1061 at a temperature of 74 degrees Celsius. Although the i7 has been delittered, the CryRig M9 CPU cooler inside the small chassis are definitely pulling their weight here. In Unison Valley at 1080p ultra settings, the system scored 2378 with an average FPS of 94.4. Now, let's take a look at a few real-world gaming benchmarks. First up, we have Doom running the Vulkan API at ultra settings. The system was buttery smooth at 1080p with an average FPS of 137 and bottom 1% frame rates at 118. 1440p was still well above that 60 FPS mark, and it's not until we increase the resolution to 4K that we see the FPS drop below that. At an average FPS of 38, Doom is still playable on the 1070, but nowhere near as fun or immersive as it was at 1440p or 1080. Ark Survival Evolved is a bit of an odd game to test due to its lack of optimization. However, the survival based game is quite popular, and here the GTX 1070 is pretty much the minimum GPU required if you want to play this at high settings. The game is technically unreleased, so hopefully we can see some sort of optimization in the future. The Witcher 3 is a good representation of how the system handles open world AAA titles currently. Note that Nvidia Hairworks has been disabled for these tests, as seeing Geralt's hair flowing through the wind isn't really worth the drop in FPS. Excluding that, we're playing at ultra settings. At 1080p, we're seeing a consistent frame rate of around 75 FPS. At 1440p, we're not quite hitting that 60 FPS mark, but I found that turning down some settings to high and reducing some anti-aliasing settings, I was able to play above 60 FPS no problem. The same can't really be said for 4K though, and if you desperately want to play at this resolution, then you may need to turn the settings down to around medium for it to be a smooth experience. Lastly, we have Battlefield 1, which to be honest is what I play mostly on this system. Although testing multiplayer is quite problematic, I made sure to play at least 15 minutes for each resolution, so that way any differences between testing could even themselves out somewhat. Here we're looking at Ballroom Blitz on a 64-man Conquest, and the system is pushing above an average of 115 FPS at 1080p, with the bottom 1% of frame times not far behind. At 1440p, the experience is still smooth, and if this is the resolution you're playing at, then I'd say you're good to go. Again, however, the 1070 proves to be lacking for 4K. You'll need to turn the settings down to around medium just to get above 60 FPS, and at that point, textures just don't look as good and you're defeating the purpose of playing at 4K in the first place. So that just about sums up everything. But if you have any questions regarding this build, then please chuck them down below. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more PC builds or similar content in the future. And also, please leave any suggestions for future videos. Thanks again, and see you in the next one.